What makes Lovecraftian horror? What aspects are vital to it, and how do these aspects make it distinct from other types of horror? I think these things are relevant things to think about, considering that in our fandom, a problem for many of us is how things are described as Lovecraftian when they really aren't. I will not take the time in this already long video to analyze the dictionary definition of it. Rather, in this video, I'm going to look at the aspects of Lovecraftian horror which I think make it what it is. The Red Pill. I hope you've watched my previous video on the Red Pill in the Mythos, because I don't want to repeat it all for this video. The too long didn't watch summary is this. Taking the Red Pill means you are now no longer ignorant about the realities of the world. You see through all the bullshit you assumed is true, and now you must come to terms with it or live with cognitive dissonance.
I don't believe it. It's not possible. Let me out! Let me out! I want out!
In the context of the mythos, this usually results in a protagonist realizing that the horrors of cosmicism are a reality for humanity, or that some creature or hidden realm exists, leading to hideous implications for humanity. A quick example would be in From Beyond, when Crawford Tillinghast reveals that hidden creatures coexist with humanity, but we can't normally see them or sense them or interact with them without the aid of his machine. An even better example comes from The Outsider, when the protagonist of that short tale realizes the truth. Well, the passage written by Lovecraft is simply beautiful. Listen quickly to it, how the Red Pill utterly wrecks the worldview of the narrator.
I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own.
Before moving on, I should specify something more. The Red Pill concept can apply to many fantasy stories. How many light-hearted fantasies result in some hitherto naive person discovering a fantastical world actually exists, and upon discovering that, the person will forevermore have to come to terms with this reality? An example would be the brilliant film Spirited Away, one of my favorites. In the beginning, the protagonist Chihiro has no idea a magical world exists parallel with what she accepted as being reality, that being the ordinary world that we live in. But later she learns that this magical world and its bizarre inhabitants actually exist. By the definition of the term, you can justly say that Chihiro has been red-pilled. As in our mythos, there is no going back from that knowledge she gained. But in Spirited Away, the world is beautiful and fun to experience, and it's not all really that bad. Hell, I think it would be an improvement on reality. In the mythos, however, it's almost always negative. The Red Pill reveals existentialist horror. It reveals that humanity is very, very far from the top of the ladder that we once thought we had climbed. We are the accidental creations of the elder things, sharing a tiny planet suspended in black seas of infinity with nameless horrors around us. The realization of this acceptance of the Red Pill, as unpleasant as it is probably the most vital aspect of Lovecraftian horror. I urge you to check out my video dedicated to that subject, links in the video description below. The what the fuck moment. In the course of some stories, but usually in horror and especially in weird fiction, there comes a single moment or scene for a character where everything they believed, their whole worldview and what they thought was possible gets blown out of the water. In short, they are overwhelmed by a sudden wave of horror-tinged existentialism, and most likely the thing going through their minds is simply, "What? What the fuck?" Typically this moment is violent, sudden, and highly unexpected. In the Call of Cthulhu, the sailors on Alia witness Cthulhu firsthand, some fainting, some going mad, and some dying. A similar result is seen in Dagon. Keep in mind that in both stories the characters simply had stumbled upon a weird landscape in the middle of the ocean, which arguably, from their perspective, was nothing more than an uncharted island. Never in their wildest dreams did they expect to see what they did. In the same story, Call of Cthulhu, when Legrasse's men venture into the swamps to arrest the voodoo cultists, some faint upon finally seeing their inhuman barbarism. In the Shadow of Innsmouth, Robert Olmsted passes out from fright and disgust upon finally seeing purebred deep ones. There are numerous such cases in Lovecraft's work, usually popping up in the final sentence, as is the case with The Outsider or Pickman's Model. One could argue that these what the fuck moments exist in other horror tales such as Dracula, but I felt that while technically true, it's different. With the story Dracula and with many vampire horror tales, in that universe vampires are not unheard of usually. Some people, like the rural villagers, believe vampires are as real as anything. Van Helsing, the vampire hunting professor, consults old texts as to what to do about vampires. Vampire mythology has existed for millennia. Yes, to finally come to the realization that they actually exist and the tales one always heard are true is a red-pilled what the fuck moment, but I just feel Lovecraftian and cosmic horror does these moments better, much better. In literature and cinema dealing with horrific threats of a more traditional manner, the characters seem to me to always be more pragmatic in the situation, as in, okay, now what do we do? These things exist, how do we deal with the situation? And then some plan is formed.
Alright, now that we all agree that we're dealing with vampires, what do we know about vampires?
In Lovecraftian horror, the characters are almost always depicted as being much more terrified and almost always at a loss as to a solution.
You're a damn joke, man! The freaking thing's alive! I was in the room, man, looking at the ice. The freaking thing jumped out.
They might form some plan in desperation, but always there is a great sense of their constant insecurity, fear, and incompetence against the antagonistic force. My conclusion as to why this is because Lovecraftian entities always tend to be things previously unknown, unseen, and unheard of, compared to the more traditional threats which have been depicted in our culture for many, many years. It is logical that in most horror stories there is some precedent to the current horror, that in that fictional world the antagonistic force isn't completely unheard of, even if never acknowledged to be real. Lovecraft said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Simply put, Lovecraft is correct. The what the fuck moments are stronger in Lovecraftian horror because the fear is much more intense and much more incapacitating to humans in that moment when they are finally confronted by something so alien, bizarre, unheard of, and horrific that their minds have no context to place it in. The post-red pill schism. After being red-pilled and having potentially survived the what the fuck moment, the character is inevitably split from humanity by the knowledge they now possess. Basically, the red-pilled versus the blue-pilled majority. If he or she tries to explain what they experience to others, they will likely be deemed crazy. The character is left alone to decide what to do with this new knowledge. In At the Mountains of Madness, William Dyer is forced to tell the world because none would listen to his advice to stay away from Antarctica. In The Call of Cthulhu, Francis Wayland Thurston stated upon finding out what he did, he would never allow himself to provide any information to others regarding Cthulhu. The protagonist of Dagon ends up committing suicide. None had believed his story. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, Robert Olmsted decided to inform the feds, using, I'm guessing, a different account of what really happened, and they subsequently raided Innsmouth, but then later realizing his true heritage, he is left to decide his fate. In film, a good example is from Dark City. A detective learns the true nature of the Dark City. He becomes reclusive, obsessed with this realization. All deem him unhinged and crazy, although we know, the audience, we know he is correct. His indecision after being broken by the existential horror. Ellen Ripley in Aliens is not believed either and finds herself isolated from the others.
Thank you, that will be all.
God damn it, that's not all! Because if one of those things gets down here, then that will be all. Then all this bullshit that you think is so important, you can just kiss all of that goodbye.
I think the post-Red Pill schism is important because it weakens the human figure, undermines their certainty and confidence about life and their place in it. The overwhelming of the human. Having reached this point, the character is potentially overwhelmed by just how fucked they are.
That's it, man. Game over, man. It's game over. What the fuck are we gonna do now? What are we gonna do?
There is no going back to ignorance. You can't blue pill yourself after taking the red pill. There is no escaping to some part of the earth where you're out of reach of the nightmare because, frankly, the horror is the universe, the cosmos, the reality. Eventually, perhaps the end of a barrel becomes a very tempting solution. If Cthulhu awakes, you're dead. If the Deep Ones crave war, you're dead. Creatures like the Hounds of Tindalos or the entities from the story From Beyond are not concerned about how far you can run or where you can hide because they can easily travel across all time and space. And how do you escape the fact that the horror is in your very blood, in your DNA, like in The Shadow over Innsmouth or the Arthur Jermyn story? How do you deal with this hopelessness, self-delusion, cognitive dissonance or madness used to create a false reality that is more comforting? Drugs, like the narrator in Dagon? Or perhaps suicide, like Arthur Jermyn did? There is literally no alternative, and these are not really solutions, are they? A man without hope might as well be dead. It's like being in a cold, windowless room with no exit. That's horror. A feeling of smallness. I think that after a character is confronted by a cosmic horror, there inevitably comes a feeling of smallness, that they are suddenly stripped of the ability to handle the situation, that they are paralyzed and stunned by terror.
Nobody trusts anybody now.
This feeling, I believe, would induce the character's brain to be flooded with questions, all which would attack and undermine the sense of security and certainty of oneself and one's species, our place in the world, and the confidence in the abilities of mankind and yourself to handle the situation.
Put that down. No. I'll put this right through your head. You guys gonna listen to Gary? You gonna let him give the orders? I mean, he could be one of those things!
This sense of smallness is conveniently enforced by the fact that many of the horrors Lovecraft invented were immense in actual size. An observation made by Johansen the sailor upon seeing Cthulhu for the first time was, "A mountain walked, or stumbled." That line always stuck with me, and Penguin Publishing even chose that one to be printed on the first page of their orange edition of Lovecraft's stories. I remember being a little kid in school, and once we were taken to a natural science museum. There was a section dedicated to marine life, and after going through a narrow corridor displaying crabs, seahorses and such animals, the corridor suddenly turned into an absolutely massive hall where the skeleton of a huge whale was created. It terrified me to imagine something so big, and it made me feel small. It is somewhat banal to create horror by using the sheer size of an antagonistic force, but it is effective. And the huge size also underlines the smallness of mankind, both literally and philosophically speaking. The degradation of man. Lovecraft detested much about humanity, but conversely loved certain aspects of it. He used to speak of man's excellence in certain areas, usually architecture, academics, and civilization. He spoke highly of his Anglo-Saxon culture, and of certain foreign cultures too, such as the Japanese and the ancient Greeks. It's like Lovecraft both admired what man could be, but loathed what he usually turned out to be. A human can be a noble, honorable, physically aesthetic creature of great intelligence, capable of great feats of technological excellence and art. To strive to even be a bit like this Ubermensch in some aspect of life is something worth doing. Now imagine how disgusting and saddening it is to see such a specimen of humanity degraded, decayed, perverted, or destroyed by the cosmic horrors of the Mythos. The Arthur Jermyn story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, The Dunwich Horror, The Rats in the Walls, The Lurking Fear, The Shadow Out of Time, The Thing on the Doorstep, The Outsider, From Beyond, and The Hound, just to name some. Some specific examples would be, well, in The Dunwich Horror, the story speaks of the decayed and undecayed Whatley families, the one relatively normal, but the other of low intelligence, low in breeding, and degenerate in manner. The latter group featured Lavinia Whatley, who is impregnated by Yog-Sothoth and then births the perverse mixture of man and monster in Wilbur Whatley and his nameless brother. The Outsider featured a protagonist of great intelligence, sensitivity and thoughtfulness, but ends up realizing his exterior and his origin is monstrous and revolting. The Rats in the Walls and The Lurking Fear feature protagonists who, although human, find out the revolting depths of depravity their ancestors had sunk to, which drives them off the edge. Recall the brilliant, artistically gifted Edward Pickman Derby and the disgusting, rotten thing he ends up as in the story The Thing on the Doorstep. Each story features an upstanding man, a credit to his race either via his intelligence, sensitivity, artistry, or upbringing, utterly obliterated in some manner. If we look at the excellent films The Thing and Alien, we can see good examples of this too. In these films, the characters are exemplary in their fields: astronauts, scientists, soldiers, engineers, whatever. Then they come into contact with some utterly blasphemous cosmic horror which destroys them. But it's not just that the characters are killed. There are tons of films and literature where humans are killed by strange beings. It's different. Let's look quickly at Predator. An alien force comes to Earth and makes quick work of elite soldiers. Sounds like it could be Lovecraftian, no? Well, Predator is very not Lovecraftian. But the deaths of Blaine and Dylan are not the same as that of Kane in Alien or Bennings from The Thing. Blaine and Dylan, they died as soldiers in combat, essentially one-on-one with the better individual winning. The Predator in a way had some sort of relationship with the soldiers it killed. They were the adversaries, targets in a battle of skills, deserving of some respect and acknowledgement, even if in the end they are to be killed for trophies. However, in Lovecraftian horror, the respective antagonistic forces lack that relationship. Humans are given no consideration or acknowledgement as being anything more than something for that force to use. They do not kill because they have anger or hatred of humans. That will be giving humanity too much meaning to them. Humans are meaningless, insignificant to them. The deaths of Kane in Alien and pretty much everyone in the Thing films takes on a much more symbolic role. They aren't just killed like how Blaine or Dylan were killed. The cosmic forces in Lovecraftian horror twist and mutilate the human into something inhumane and revolting to witness. To see something once human end up like this is just, I cannot eloquently describe it. It's just fucked up. I really hope I made my point. That is not merely the extreme violence that I'm highlighting here for my point. It is the perversion of a once thinking, feeling, intelligent being into something revolting. Tentacles. Now, I know what you're thinking. You accidentally subscribed to a guy who thinks tentacles equals Lovecraftian. Just hear me out before you hit unsubscribe. I actually already made a whole video about why tentacles are so prominent in Lovecraftian fiction, so I won't go into a ton of detail here. You can check that video out in the video description below. I'll leave a link. But basically, I think that tentacles are used by Lovecraft because they are such an inhuman appendage, and thus act as a perfect way to represent his type of horror, an extreme juxtaposition between the human and something that is so obviously alien and strange. Furthermore, tentacles are associated with animals coming from the ocean, and the ocean itself is quite an alien, bizarre, and often hostile place for humans. Its immensity and sense of awe it inspires, its ability to make us feel small and powerless, is not unlike cosmos and space itself. So since squid and octopi come from the ocean and are extremely weird looking, why not use their features on entities coming from space or realms unknown to us? I believe this is the logic Lovecraft was working with. Obviously, it is not a must that a Lovecraftian antagonistic force have tentacles. There are plenty that do not, such as Tsuthogoa, the Hounds of Tindalos, or even not have a body at all, such as the Color from The Color Out of Space. Junji Ito created a masterpiece of cosmic horror just by using spirals. Yeah, you know, spirals, as in a line that overlaps itself as it grows bigger. By the way, I reviewed that story on my channel before, and I'll leave a link in the description below in case you missed it. Tentacles, a weird color, or spirals. In all cases, a sense of Lovecraftian dread is successfully instilled in the reader. In short, when I say tentacles are an important aspect of Lovecraftian horror, I'm just using tentacles as an example, conveniently often used by HPL himself, for any type of trait that is extremely inhuman in aspect. It's a trait that is so foreign to us that it highlights just how alien and not like us the antagonistic force is. Substitute tentacles for anything you like that serves the same purpose. In conclusion, what I've just shown you are simply aspects that I subjectively think make something Lovecraftian. Aspects that I have noticed reoccurring in weird tales and films which are rightly often labeled as Lovecraftian. I don't want you to now think that creating Lovecraftian horror is as simple as ticking the boxes on a checklist. It isn't. Yes, I believe these aspects are important and in some cases vital, just as how you can't make a romance story without lovers or an action story without violence or something going on. Some aspects will always be vital to technically fulfill criteria. But it's art, and as such, it will never be that black and white. Anyway, I really hope you liked this video. It took a surprising number of revisions and rewrites and editing until I felt even close to satisfied with the script, but I think I said what I needed to say. Anyway, I will see you guys in the next video that I do. I hope everyone stays nameless and blasphemous. Until then, see you around.